Hey, folks.
Hey, Mark.
Hey, Mark, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I did confirm with Steve this morning that he is still planning on attending. And he will need about 20 minutes for his presentation.
Sounds great. Just a reminder for everyone to please register your attendance in the meeting notes, which I just sent via the chat. And then also that during this meeting we'll abide by the SLSA and Linux Foundation Code of Conduct. Is there anyone new to this group who wants to say hi?
Sure, I'll jump in. Bradford Bartlett here. I work at Sonos, a speaker company. So I've been reading some information on SLSA. I thought I'd just join these meetings as an observer just to learn more, get a better understanding of it. So glad to be here and thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
I usually, sorry, I mean, I usually don't join during this because I'm not usually up during this time zone, but I'm in the vicinity, so.
Ian.
Hey.
Yeah, so in this meeting we often get into like details. So certainly you're welcome to join. We also have Steve here, who I think just joined the call, who among other things is, I guess, the maintainer of CycloneDX. I'm not sure what the official title is, but he will be joining us to talk about the formulation, which is, I think, logically similar or like equivalent, I think, to the like our build model and provenance. So anyways, Steve.
Hey, Mark. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Springett. I do a lot of work for the OWASP Foundation. I'm the chair of the CycloneDX Bill of Materials Standard, co-leader of the OWASP Dependency Track project, which was now 10 years old, a project that analyzes bills of materials, and one of the co-authors of the OWASP Software Component Verification Standard, or SCVS. Glad to be here.
Thanks for joining, Steve. And I'll preface this with, I invited Steve to join today's meeting because I know we're doing the provenance draft. And there's always a lot of conversations about, how can we use an SBOM to verify SLSA compliance, et cetera. And so I know that there are things that may not currently be in the specification, but I know there's work being done on the 1.5 specification, and there is a GitHub issue in SLSA about formulation and trying to align with that. So I figured let's get Steve in here and get him to present on formulation and what's coming. Thanks, Steve. You can start your presentation if you're ready.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. Let me just share my thing here. Okay. All right, so we're working on a lot of interesting things in CycloneDX this year and into next. So this year is 1.5. We're targeting the beginning of Q2 for that. Q2 is going to introduce MLBOM, formulation support, excuse me, formulation support, which is also known as manufacturing bill of materials, or MBOM, which is an industry term used for the last 20, 30 years. We're introducing support for low-code application platforms, which unfortunately, no bill of material format can actually describe today. So we're doing that, doing a bunch of other stuff, especially with vulnerability disclosure reports. 1.6, we're introducing support for CBOM or cryptographic bill of material. This is really about, post-quantum, algorithm support, making sure that, which algorithms we have. This is contributed by IBM. We might actually push this into this year. We'll see. But we've got a bunch of other things on the table as well that people want. So diving into formulation. So formulation is specifically the idea of how something was made. So this is going to be a top-level element in a Cyclone DX bomb. And it can either be existing in an existing bomb, or it can be externalized into individual M bombs. One thing we want to prevent, however, is a scenario where it provides a roadmap to the attacker. So in all of the NTIA discussions going back to 2018, and even included in one of their FAQs, is this idea that SBOMs are absolutely not a roadmap to the attacker, and we want to maintain that. However, once you start including some of this data in there, yeah, it actually can be a roadmap to the attacker. So we want to make it very easy for organizations to be able to externalize this, or to be able to include or exclude it on demand. Thankfully, the Cyclone DX object model is very, very simple, and it would be elementary for us to either include it or exclude it pretty much on demand based on the authorization of the people actually requesting the bill of material. In essence, formulation describes how something was made versus how something should have been made. You can think of it as what was documented on the recipe versus what actually happened in the kitchen. If you spilled all that flour on the counter and picked it up, yeah, those were steps on the recipe that weren't included, but you can document that. Our formulation support needs to support all the types of inventory that we support, including hardware, software, and all the services that we support as well. One of the things that we're trying to drive at, however, is describing the precise mechanics for reproducibility, which is mostly theoretical today. I haven't actually been able to create what I would consider a reproducible build. And I'm not talking about the bit for bit, checksums and that sort of, that's fairly elementary. But true reproducibility is really, really hard. And so we're trying to at least document everything around that would allow an organization to truly understand what is necessary for true reproducibility, which is essentially what an M-bomb does, right? If I am manufacturing 1 million widgets, maybe they're iPhones, maybe they're IoT toasters. If I'm manufacturing these things, I need to do them in mass and across potentially multiple factories. So, and still have identical end products at the result. So our support for MBOM is truly trying to capture all of that. It's going to be available in all serialization formats, XML, JSON, protobuf, and finally it maps to the SCVS BOM maturity model, which will also be out, I think, early Q2-ish, something like that. Formulation is really based on events. So it consists of formulas, parallel and linear sequences, input and output tasks, or input and output things. It could be components, services, whatever, tasks, executors, configurations, environments, etc. So we're trying to capture holistically everything necessary for true reproducibility. Some of the scenarios that we're trying to describe in formulation is, how was my software made? That's easy. How was my ML model trained? A little bit harder. How was my IoT toaster manufactured? little bit harder yet. And finally, how was my service deployed? Hopefully not that hard. But these are some of the things that we're trying to capture. Let's see. First of all, let me stop and see if there's any questions so far.
I think one thing, Trishank had asked, do you have a link to the slides? Are these publicly shareable?
Yeah, I'll share them out. Absolutely.
Okay, great, thanks.
I have a question for the salsa community, not you, Steve, so you can feel free to continue. So one of the questions I had for the salsa community is, if you go to the previous slide, Steve, slide 4, could this help with that salsa level 3, level 4, you know, verification slash creating of that artifact that a build process would go through, et cetera? Because I see a lot of the same things in the definitions today. I know they're not in CycloneDX right now, but just trying to get a sense of, would this help? Is this very similar to what we're trying to do, but we can't do today with SBOMs because there isn't a place for it? Just that kind of thought process, right? Can we consolidate? Not consolidate. Can we make sure that we're not recreating the wheel, so to speak?
Yeah, overall, I think this is very similar to what is in our provenance format, although the salsa provenance format is much more limited in scope. Like it's only intended to cover the production of software artifacts as opposed to like hardware or processes. There's an explicit notion of like, well, I'm not sure if we should talk about that now or just wait to the end. But like it's kind of optimized for a particular use case. But I think I agree with you that if we could have one format, that would be better than two, just in general. And if we do have two formats, if the models align, that would be better than if they're just completely different. So yeah, I feel like it's maybe worthwhile to go to the end of the presentation and we could talk about how much overlap there is. Okay.
Yeah, or at least the thought process of, even if we decide to have two paths that are very similar, how can we ingest this? Folks, obviously in the industry, will get to pick and choose. And if they're already doing, let's say, CycloneDX or SPDX, they're going to want to try to stick with it. They're not going to want to try something new. So just kind of keep that in mind as we keep going through this.
Okay, so that was really all that I had to share. I just wanted to provide you kind of some high-level things about what we're doing. I can dive into kind of what we have in terms of some really, really rough drafts at the moment. But yeah, that's all for the slides.
I mean, I would like to see the rough drafts. If you're okay sharing them, I think that'd be valuable. And then we could also compare to what we have, because we're working on a 1.0 format for provenance, and we could maybe it's probably worthwhile to compare and contrast to see.
Yeah. So let me share my IntelliJ, and I'll probably have to bump up these fonts, I would imagine, right? This is really, really, really early draft. So in this particular example, I've got Acme library. This is what I'm describing. And the formulation, which again is a top level element, I have, you know, 0 or more formulas that I can represent. Every formula has an identity, name, description, etc., who manufactured it. And then you have these sequences. This is all kind of subject to change, by the way. We still haven't fleshed a lot of stuff out. But in fact, I think we have a call tomorrow or sometime this week to flesh some more stuff out. But again, everything is based on events. You can have parallel and series events that are happening. Everything has inputs and outputs. So in this particular case, we've got an input of you know, this Java hello world.java. We also have an input of bluefish.java. We could also have inputs of services and inputs of hardware, or, you know, whatever else we're doing as well. And then we're outputting hello world.class and bluefish.class, which is the compiled variants of those things. We could also output services and, you know, all kinds of other stuff as well. Right now, this event contains a task with we're tracking who it's executed by, the steps necessary to complete that task, what tools are responsible, whether it was automated, whether human intervention was required or not. The task can have dependency on other things. So if you need something else to run either sequentially or prior to, you can specify that. Who the executor was. So in this particular case, looks like it's Jenkins, and then we've got the bill of materials to Jenkins and that sort of thing. We've got the operating system that it was running on. It was running on this particular device, and it had this particular hardware, or excuse me, this particular configuration. So we're tracking the environment configurations, any kind of externalized, you know, configuration on the file system, that sort of thing. So anyway, that's kind of what we have today. Again, a lot of this stuff is going to be, a lot of this stuff will definitely change, but this is kind of our thought process today. We are working with we're working with a couple of different pretty large projects, and they are trying to see if our formulation support will actually work for these really, really large projects. So anyway, that's where we're at today.
So for Mark and team, I know we're trying to describe the entire build process, if I'm not mistaken. Could this work in that scenario? Or is there something missing that maybe we can provide feedback to Steve? Or is it too early to tell?
So I guess maybe why don't I present what we like, just to compare the SLSA example, and then I could talk about like what I see as the big difference. Okay, you can hear me now. So here is the current latest draft. It's almost to be submitted, but not yet submitted. And our main model so far in the current draft is that we're trying to model the build as a whole and not get into the details, because the particular use case that we're trying to solve is to make that a build runs completely automatically, that we have to trust some underlying system, some platform, whether that's like a build service like GitHub Actions or Google Cloud Build, Circle CI, something like that. It could theoretically be like a hardware trusted something. Either way, they're like some sort of trust base that we just have no choice to trust. And we just identify that, like draw a box around it and identify that with a single label. And then there's some amount of external parameters that tenants of the system, users of the system, can pass in. So for example, with GitHub Actions, the platform would be GitHub Actions as a whole. I'm trusting GitHub as an organization to do things properly and have the right, insider controls and security and everything. And then the parameters to that would be, for example, let me give an example. Something like we would say this was GitHub Actions workflow. The parameters were this workflow. It was build from this Git repository at branch main using the workflow name release.yaml. And most builds don't actually have any parameters in practice, but technically there's ways to pass in additional parameters, and we capture them here. And we could record additional information as needed, and you could also record the actual artifacts that went into it. But the most interesting bit from the SLSA perspective, the most critical bit is this bit, which is the external parameters. And what we want is verification down the stream that these were as expected. So if you're building, for example, the hello world binary, it really is supposed to come from this particular Git repo and this particular branch. And if someone builds from a fork, that's what we're trying to detect. We kind of go into a bit more details in the threats page of kind of enumerate the different threats. But that's kind of the main model or the main idea, which is we have some simplified model of the build overall, and we're just trying to make sure that uses of that. There'd also be some amount of chain, like when you use a dependency, like I think in Steve's example, it was like a Java file or something like that. Or in this GitHub Actions, there was like some other action input. You could recursively verify those, but each of those you could view as a unit. So that's what the current thinking is. And in terms of so anyway, let me just stop there to see if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. And, I think there's a lot of potential ways that we could potentially work together. Because I think CycloneDX formulation support is certainly going to handle this use case. Formulation is, you can get as general or as in the weeds as you want. And if you want to provide all that, nitty-gritty detail, you can. But if you just want to provide some overviews, such as, set the oven to 350, bake for 25 minutes type of thing, you can certainly get as general as that as well.
Yeah, the main, I think, a difference, or what I didn't see in a couple seconds looking at that, of the CycloneDX draft, and also the SPDX equivalent, is the separation of who made what claim, because I think that's a big, and I'm sure it's probably possible to represent, but that's kind of something we're trying to make as easy to get right as possible. That, for example, GitHub only claims that I took this input and I ran it. It doesn't make a claim that it ran this compiler or it used this particular source file, because those are running inside the VM under the tenant's control. And so GitHub can't make any claims about that. The tenant might make a claim, but then the entity that we're trusting is the tenant and not GitHub. And so that separation, I think, is the big one.
Yeah, so we've got the executed by, which can either be an individual or an organization. That might actually fit into there. So under a task, we can say that, GitHub actually was the one who executed it, not you. So that might work.
And then would that be a separate signed document? Because that's how all of this is done, is that there's a signing key for each statement. And so each entity signs the thing separately, so it can't be tampered with or forged.
Yeah, how would you collect the entirety then?
The thinking is that each like actual artifact would have its own provenance. Again, using the term that Salsa used, I know.
Right.
So please excuse that difference. So for example, if you have a container image that was produced by taking, let's say, a base image and then a couple binaries and some other files, the output image would have provenance that just lists what the inputs were. And then each of those inputs would have its own provenance, and then you would kind of like assemble them kind of on demand. The actual distribution of these things is a separate piece.
Yeah, so Cyclone has this concept called bomb link. We have a registered URN that allows us to describe the identity. So every bill of material in Cyclone has an identity, and then you can have, each individual component, service, etc. within a bomb can also have its own identity. And with bomb link, which is again a formally registered IANA spec, but you can specify the precise bill of material and element within that bill of material that you are referencing. So yeah, all of that would be possible.
I have one more question, Mark. I thought I heard you say, and I think I see it in the GitHub issue, that the provenance definition is different than Cyclone DX. And so I'm curious as to why we're not using the NIST definition of provenance, if that's what the industry is going to be using for the most part, right?
I don't know if we want to get into this here. I think my interpretation of the NIST standard is different than Steve's. So I don't know if we're going to resolve that.
Okay.
Here. Like when I read the text of what NIST, I think what Salsa is doing does meet that. I think the OWASP interpretation is different. I guess that's at a high level.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk offline. Any questions for Steve before we let him go?
I feel like a good, probably the best way to resolve this would be for like to get an example, like to get examples in the different formats. Like we have one, and we're going to get a couple more of the Salsa provenance format, like to actually describe, right now we have the GitHub Actions. We'll do something for GitLab CI and maybe a couple others. See what it looks like and say, okay, this is how someone would produce it, how someone would consume it. Does it accurately represent what we want as ambiguous? And then we could say, well, for the Cyclone DX 1.5 formulation format, what would that look like? What would they have to produce? And compare. I think that's probably the best way is to look at concrete examples. Actually, Steve, is the current draft public right now?
It is not. So we're kind of doing a skunkworks type thing right now. We've got about a dozen or so people working on it. It's folks from Red Hat, Clues Foundation, IBM, etc., ServiceNow. So we anticipate that that'll probably go public, I don't know, sometime mid-February. So it's coming up because we've got to get it out there to meet some of our requirements for our standardization process. So yeah, give us a couple weeks.
I suspect where we're at right now is that is like just a lack of bandwidth in trying to resolve this, right? Of like from the Cyclone DX side, it is a nice to have, but not a priority to resolve with the Salsa side. On the SLSA side, it is a nice to have to resolve with the Cyclone DX, but not a not the #1 priority. And so I think no one is putting at the top of their list to try to resolve the differences. So I suspect if someone wants to do that, like I said, a good thing would be to like take the same data and represent in both formats. That would probably be a good next step, I think.
Yeah, I can do some cat herding to do that. I wouldn't be the best technical person to do that, but I know folks that are very much interested in this topic. So as long as I know where to get the output from the SLSA side, then I think, I can try to lead that effort.
Yeah, we have in the already submitted in the repo in let me paste in the chat and also the meeting notes. At the bottom, there's an example. And now remember, this would be actually wrapped inside like a DISI or some other signed thing, because it would be signed in this case by GitHub or some entity that represents GitHub. Like we have these GitHub Actions reusable workflows. So that's the entity is not just GitHub, but the trust base is GitHub plus this project plus SigStore. So like the trust base is a little bit bigger. So the Cyclone DX example, Cyclone DX supports signing as well. So that similarly would be wrapped in a signature as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thanks, Steve, for joining. Feel free to hang out. If not, you can drop. But really
Thanks for
appreciate your
inviting.
time.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And any questions, reach out to me. Steve.springett@owas.org. I'll put that in the chat.
Thanks so much,
Cheers.
Steve. I really appreciate this. This is really helpful.
All right. Y'all want me to go ahead and jump in on the SLSA compliance?
Sounds great.
Awesome. So we met last week or week ago, a couple weeks ago, and kind of talked a little bit about what we're up to. But I'd like to give like a little bit of a fuller description of the what we got going on right this moment. So we're working on a compliance program. Conformance was not the correct terminology we learned last week, so we're calling it the compliance program. And basically, the idea is to allow builders, so that would be like a GitHub or a Google Cloud or anybody who offers a build service to show that they are compliant with SLSA to allow people to trust the provenance that's generated from the build service. And so this is done. The idea is that we'll have a self-certification. So that would be where information is provided to the customer about how the build system is meeting security requirements. And then the kind of second would be not right now because it requires resources in terms of staffing and legal work and stuff like that, but an accredited third-party certification program. And that would be where you invite an auditor into your organization to look at how you accomplish, how you meet the standard, and they would kind of give you a third-party audit. And so we're thinking right now about how to integrate those kind of concepts into tooling and how that should be displayed to the user. So there's several draft. Well, there's one draft PR, and then there's a full PR out from Chris K over at Google, where we are working on integrating it into the requirements so that we can kind of discuss what it means to be certified, either self-certified or third-party audited. against the SLSA requirements. Was there anything in particular, Melba, that you think that we should address about that?
No, not at this time.
All right, and Chris, if you have anything to add, please feel free to jump in. Cool. Any questions on, so you can see the, one is the file kind of just showing the diff of adding, I'm sorry.
Are you supposed to be sharing?
Oh, I don't have anything in particular. I don't have slides or anything to share.
Oh, I heard, as you can see, sorry for interrupting. So I thought you were sharing.
In the notes, I guess. If you, right here, in the notes under SLSA conformance program, there's a Google Doc that kind of was the initial draft of what we were thinking. And then there's two GitHub links to new text that we're working on. The second one's the draft PR of kind of a new page outlining the compliance program, and then another one with a registry. For that self-certification, we're thinking of how that can be displayed to users and how that could be integrated into tooling. So we're talking to the SLSA Verifier project on exactly how different builders sign projects and how we could connect some of the evidences that are published to a actual piece of provenance. So we're thinking that there might need to be some work as well in the future on how exactly a builder signs provenance, because in some cases, from what we've heard recently, is pretty much every builder signs provenance in a different way. And so it's very hard to connect a particular cryptographic key back to a particular build service. And so kind of future thinking is about how we want to standardize that so that the tooling can kind of say, oh, hey, this particular build service that signed this document, they have published information onto the registry. You as a user who's trying to verify the provenance of your artifact, you want to know about how it was built and what the builder does to protect you. Having links to that evidence would be valuable, but right now it's very difficult to tie back a particular piece of provenance back to the build system that generated it. So that's some of the ongoing thinking and work. And please do look at those two PRs and please give feedback. We're obviously working through some of the kind of more legal complex language, and so we want to make sure that we have everyone on board for it, because we're trying to set up that structure. Yeah.
So I know one of the reasons why this all came about was because people were claiming SLSA level 3, level 4 compliance, and requirements weren't really set in stone.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you intend on policing that if they don't go through this and they are saying they're SLSA level 3, so SLSA level 4 compliance?
Exactly. Yeah. So the idea is with a SLSA verifier, if you trust the builder and you can get the provenance and throw it into a verifier, you should be able to verify pretty much all aspects of SLSA as a consumer yourself. The only big gap there is that you have to trust the builder for you to be able to trust the attestations, right? To a large degree. So if you want part of the structure of the certification program is kind of a work in progress idea of tiers. So if they haven't published any information to the SLSA registry, then there's kind of an assumption that as a user, you may want to look into or contact the build system, the owner of the builder service yourself, and kind of get some information because they haven't provided anything publicly. And then kind of that tier 1 is, well, if you want, you can look at the answers they've provided. And then tier 2 would be, well, a third party has audited that the build system is doing the correct things in order to allow SLSA level 3+ builds. And that could, since it's the idea would be that the OpenSSF has accredited those third-party auditors. And so you can kind of automatically trust based on the provenance if it's verified. So the idea is giving users basically the information they need to check for themselves that SLSA, the particular SLSA level that they're looking for is met in the provenance of their artifacts that they are utilizing. And so if there is no information provided from the build system about how they are actually ensuring that the requirements are met, then as a user, you can kind of say, well, they claim to be SLSA this, but there's no information. And so I'm not sure if I trust that. Another kind of tangential idea from the original draft was potentially if they have self-certified and published on the registry, they could gain some sort of rights to utilize SLSA trademarks in marketing materials, as long as they link back to the page. But those kinds of things require OpenSSF legal. So it's not kind of in scope for our current work, at least to my understanding. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, so actually, I think related to that, does the OpenSSF or the Linux Foundation plan to, in the very least, police like very obviously bad actors or folks who are like demonstrably misrepresenting SLSA? Because I know one of the problems we have had in a little bit in the past was, you know, like we've seen already a couple of folks. Mostly just due to ignorance more so than maliciousness, but, you know, state something like, hey, you know, there's a SLSA 5 or whatever. You're like, there's clearly not one of these things. Now, in certain cases, it's just like, hey, there's a misunderstanding. But I do know that some folks are, I think, a little worried, not so much about like the self-attestation part, but the sort of like, yeah, I'm SLSA 4 and I'm not providing a self-assessment or whatever. Right, like I'm hitting SLSA, but I'm not providing a SLSA, you know, one of those things. And if they do use obviously the SLSA branding, it begins to dilute some of what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I can't speak to the OpenSSF's legal teams or anything like that. I would hope that they would defend their trademark. I believe it's required under at least US law to defend your trademark if you plan on protecting it at any time in the future. So, but that's not something that I can speak to. If there's anybody from OpenSSF on the call that wants to kind of address that, then please do. No? Great, Aaron?
Yeah, and you know, just thinking about, you know, the enforcement or just kind of the applicability of someone claiming to have that SLSA level. If we're able to demonstrate this with, you know, the provenance and the verified build system type of spec, or the compliance spec that we're kind of alluding to, that's going to be really important. And I think Melba, right, with the positioning, right, encouraging people to not just trust that someone says that they're this certain level. It's actually, hey, show us the receipts, right? Let's use some SLSA tooling to verify this information through a policy, right? That's where the rubber meets the road, in my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. My kind of vision is that all the major build system owners will have been third-party audited by a OpenSSF accredited audit company, and then the users can just download the software and check the provenance and verify it and have kind of the trust in that. And if the tool spits out level 1 and the company claimed level 3, well, then that customer has a action against the company that sold them the software, right, or provided the software. So that's kind of the overall goal. Obviously, would be for users to have full power in this to check anybody lying kind of egregiously. Yeah, I think Arnaud, you were first.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I mean, so typically certification programs run within a legal framework. if you look at the CNCF Kubernetes certification program, for instance, they have terms and conditions. There is basically, when you apply to be listed as, a conformant, certified conformant implementation of Kubernetes, you sign a contract. You need to name somebody and so on. And there are terms and conditions, including something that says, hey, if we find out that you're actually, this is a false claim, we will terminate this. And you have something like 2 weeks to remediate this situation or something like this. So, I mean, I think the Linux Foundation has the kind of framework we can leverage to do that. And it does address this kind of issues. Obviously, if you have tools that can help, you can run tests and that makes it that much easier. But independently of whether you can run tests or rely on a third party to make some claim, there are some legal framework at the end of the day. Anybody can challenge it, and if the case might be, it can be canceled.
Yeah, I would love to have legal from OpenSSF participate. If anyone knows anybody, please forward the docs to them. That would be wonderful. Unfortunately, I don't think anybody, unless Chris has a secret degree, a law degree, and I don't know.
But we don't want to improvise this. I mean, we can contact Mike Dolan, is the legal head at the Linux Foundation, and he can point us to the right person.
Okay.
Happy to introduce you.
I guess we can ask David Wheeler, or wait, who was the name?
Mike Dolan.
Mike Dolan. Okay. If you'd be willing to set that up, that'd be fantastic.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yes.
And Michael?
Mike.
Yep. And I think related to that, I know one of the things sooner rather than later we would want to make sure is very clear is who are these third-party auditors and how does somebody become a third-party auditor? Because I already know a lot of folks have been asking a lot of questions of like, just around like what are the requirements to do that, and is there a process to do that? And because I'm sure there's folks who are going to be very interested in becoming official SLSA assessors or auditors. And I think there's also some worry that depending on when, like especially with how this stuff gets released, there's a worry that if, for example, all of a sudden the first people who are part of it are, let's say, the people who are developing I'm not saying that's the case, but like there's a concern, I think, like, are these people who already are, under the table or whatever, starting to organize like, yeah, we'll be the first one out of the gate. I think we just need to be really, really careful about that sort of thing. Also from a legal perspective, just to make sure that it's clear that like there's no favoritism happening in who is being selected as, let's say, the first set of auditors or assessors and that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a big thing that we kind of talked about is how do we obviously don't want to just embed in tooling, well, we trust these 3 major big companies and their build systems because reasons, right? We would love to have an even playing field, and that's kind of why the self-certification part is coming first, or at least we plan to bring that first. That allows smaller companies to kind of good faith put information out there. But then that accreditation process is something we'll have to work on. If you as you review the documentation or the draft PRs and stuff, you'll see we have a big to-do section for the third-party certified section, which hopefully, as we work with legal, we can kind of get a little bit more on how that could look. Obviously, resources are needed to develop, like Chris said, training materials, kind of workflows that auditors need to run through. All that type of stuff needs to be developed, and that's a lot that will probably need somebody full-time just for accrediting, or part-time just for accrediting people or accrediting audit companies. But yeah, Jay?
Yeah, so a lot of this stuff, there's too much. There's, I mean, this is what I hear. I hear a lot of trusted individuals here rather than processes. A lot of this stuff could be sorted out. The CSA does a pretty good job of this. They have that thing called the STAR registry, right? You have like this 1, 2, and 3 where you have those that self-attested, those that have gone through third party you know, audits and you know, the such, right? And then they'll be able to provide that documentation and they'll get put on a registry, right? So maybe we can develop a registry that has those who have self-attested, those who have been through third-party audits. Now, on the other end of that, there can be a process by which
that's part of the draft PR. I would love your review. This is actually based on the STAR program.
Okay, so
that's
we're
a great
talking
call
about
out.
that. All right.
Yeah, exactly.
But we're talking, okay, good. And then of course, when it comes to auditors, there's a processes by which third parties can become auditors as well. So you don't have to trust or a specific few. You can have a process for it and they can complete the process. And then by completing the process, they can become auditors. And then it's open to everyone.
Yeah, that the attestation, the accreditation, that will be an accreditation program for auditors, but that's not something we have gotten to quite yet. We're still working on that self-certification part.
Okay, well, I mean, it sounds like everything. I mean, I'm throwing my 2 cents in because there's a lot of.
Yeah, it's great input.
Trust the person, not the process. The processes are everything, and for this, processes are everything.
Yeah, 100%. Any other thoughts, comments, concerns? Again, please do review the PRs that are out there if you have any interest at all. Oh, wonderful! There's a contact in the chat. Thanks, Arno. I really do appreciate that. That's wonderful. All right. Well, that's all I got from my perspective. Anybody else? Final call on this point? No. All right. I'll cede the floor.
Thanks. One last topic that came up in a pull request that we wanted to briefly discuss was in the SLSA V1 requirements, what do we actually require of the consumer? So let me present briefly. So here is this readable. Let me actually move it so we get a smaller page. Should we move the nav on this page? Well, is that readable? I can't see.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Yes.
So we have this model where we have the different entities. There's the software producer, the entity that writes and maintains the software, the build system, the packaging ecosystem, and then the individual consumer. Roughly speaking, well, we haven't really talked about what the consumer's responsibilities are. In my head, I think the package ecosystem would create the capability of like setting expectations and verifying expectations. Like it's up to the producer. Well, it may be up to the producer to set them. It may be up to the consumer to actually turn it on, but the ecosystem like has to turn on the capability. Maybe it happens automatically. Maybe you have to opt in for it. Right now, we say the consumer may have to opt in. Arno started a pull request that's not the actual correct use of the term may from like a technical sense. And so we should say what they must do. But then the question is, if it's opt-in, what is mandatory? If systems are designed so the consumer doesn't have to do anything, what's opt-in? Anyway, Arno, do you want to explain more?
Yeah. So first, on the technical aspect, I mean, may is capitalized, which is, RFC 2119, which is not the right use of that term here. So it doesn't mean, the answer is to put a must, but I thought, well, if we want to add any requirements, we should express it in that way. And but the question, it seems like my understanding is the opt-in basically wants to recognize that there may be cases where the ecosystem does not have it turned on by default. And it says, well, it's kind of like having your car provide a seatbelt, but if you don't put it on, then you're out of luck. It does give you no benefits, right? So the constructor of the vehicle might be, compliant and provide the safety feature, but if it's not turned on, it doesn't do you any good. So my understanding of the intent was here to say, well, if it's not on by default, we rely on the consumer to actually turn it on. Fundamentally, that's my interpretation. And then I thought the way it is worded here is not correct. And instead, we should say something along those lines of, if it's not on by default, the consumer must turn it on. That was what I tried to convey through the pull request. And then, the exact wording is not necessarily easy to get, but there was this question, is that the right requirement? Do we really want to force the user to do that?
Yeah, and thanks for, you worded it much better than I did. And so where this kind of came up was, if we word it as, if the ecosystem requires you to opt in to turn on verification, the consumer must do it. A separate topic that we've talked about, or a similar topic, is having a monitoring only mode. So if we, for example, just monitor that all the packages are SLSA compliant, can you call that SLSA even if there is no actual enforcement? So they kind of are related here. Yeah, Aaron?
This actually speaks pretty nicely to the comment I made a little bit earlier, right? So if you're participating as a consumer in the SLSA ecosystem, you're participating, right? You're not just viewing a badge on a GitHub repo. So I think if we consider the consumer, right, they're not a passive consumer, they're an active consumer. So they must, right, verify this thing. So I think it's appropriate to say they must verify, and if it's an opt-in, they must turn it on, right? Or else they're not a SLSA consumer, I suppose, right? The monitoring thing is kind of interesting, and that can be alternative to what I just said, but.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in Optane, which is a version of TUF for automotives, the way we fixed this was to say exactly the question compliant comes in. Are you really compliant if you're not actually verifying all of this, nice attestations? On the other hand, I do think that there's room for different verification modes, so to speak, which is what we ended up doing in Optane. So for example, Mark's idea of doing monitoring only mode may be the default baseline verification, shall we say, for the lack of a better word. And then we have stronger levels of verification.
So we're out of time, so I don't expect us to have a final answer on this, but so hopefully this has raised, the issue to the level of interest people, so that, please go to the issue and speak up so we can get to resolution. Then once this is settled, when we agree on the requirement, I can rework on the PR to get the proper wording in.
Yeah, it's kind of like a theoretical thing of almost like what does SLSA mean? Is it in the eye of the beholder? Something around that, like what Aaron said around the participant thing. It's not clear in my head, so that's why I created the separate issue, because it's almost a little bit more beyond just the one wording thing. So certainly any comments would be really appreciated there to help us resolve. And with that, we're out of time. So thank you, everybody. Look forward to talking to you online and then seeing you at the next meeting. Bye,
Thank you. Bye-bye.